Spiritual Insights, excerpts from Leo Tolstoy's diary. 1. Have been thinking one thing, that this life which we see around us is a movement of matter according to fixed, well-known laws, but that in us we feel the presence of an altogether different law, having nothing in common with the others and requiring from us the fulfillment of its demands. It can be said that we see and recognize all the other laws only because we have in us this law. If we did not recognize this law, we would not recognize the others. This law is different from all the rest, principally in this, that those other laws are outside of us and forces us to obey them. But this law is in us, and more than in us. It is our very selves, and therefore it does not force us when we obey it, but on the contrary frees us, because in following it, we become ourselves. And for this reason, we are drawn to fulfill this law, and we sooner or later will inevitably fulfill it. In this, then, consists the freedom of the will. This freedom consists in this, that we should recognize that which is, namely, that this inner law is ourselves. This inner law is what we call reason, conscience, love, the good, God. These words have different meanings, but all from different angles mean one and the same thing. In our understanding of this inner law, the Son of God, consists indeed the essence of the Christian doctrine. The world can be looked upon in this way. A world exists governed by certain well-known laws, and within this world are beings subject to the same laws, but who at the same time bear in themselves another law not in accord with the former laws of the world, a higher law, and this law must inevitably triumph within these beings and defeat the lower law. And in this struggle, and in the gradual victory of the higher law over the lower, in this only is life for man and the whole world. 2. I have thought during this time much in meaning. Much of it I could not understand and have forgotten. 1. I have often wanted to suffer, wanted persecution. That means that I was lazy and didn't want to work so that others should work for me, torturing me, and I should only suffer. 2. It is terrible, the perversions of the mind to which men expose children for their own purposes during the time of their education. The rule of conscious materialism is only explained by this. The child is instilled with such nonsense that afterwards the materialistic, limited, false conception, which is not developed to the conclusions which would show its falsity, appears like an enormous conquest of the intellect. 3. I made a note. Violence frees, and it was something very clear and important, and now I don't remember what it was at all. Violence is a temptation because it frees us from the strain of attention, from the work of reasoning. One must labor to undo a knot, to cut it is shorter. 4. A usual perversion of reason, which is made through a violently enforced faith, is to make men satisfied either with idolatry or with materialism, which at bottom is one and the same thing. Faith in the reality of our conceptions is faith in an idol, and the consequences are the same. One must bring sacrifices to it. 5. I can imagine consciousness transferred to the life of the spirit to such a degree that the sufferings of the body would be met gladly. 6. A beautiful woman smiles, and we think that because she smiles, she says something good and true when she smiles. But often, the smile seasons something entirely foul. 7. Education. It is worthwhile occupying oneself with education in order to find out all one's shortcomings. Seeing them, you will begin to correct them. But to correct oneself is indeed the best method of education for one's children and for others and for grown-up people. 8. To love means to desire that which the beloved object desires. The objects of love desire opposing things, and therefore we can only love that which desires one and the same thing. But that which desires one and the same thing is God. 9. Man, beginning to live, loves only himself and separates himself from other beings, in that he constantly loves that which alone constitutes his being. But as soon as he recognizes himself as a separate being, he recognizes also his own love, and he is no longer content with this love for himself, and he begins to love other beings. And the more he lives a conscious life, the greater and greater number of beings he will begin to love, though not with such a stable and unceasing love as that with which he loves himself. But nevertheless, in such a way that he wishes good to everything he loves, and he rejoices at this good, and suffers at the evil which tries the beloved beings, and he unites into one all that he loves. As life is love, why not suppose that my self, that which I consider to be myself and love with a special love, is perhaps the union I made in a former life of things which I loved, just as I am making a union of things now. The other has already taken place, and this one is taking place. Life is the enlargement of love, the widening of its borders, and this widening is going on in various lives. In the present life, this widening appears to me in the form of love. This widening is necessary for my inner life, and it is also necessary for the life of this world. But my life can manifest itself not only in this form. It manifests itself in an innumerable quantity of forms. Only this one is apparent to me. But in the meantime, the movement of life understood by me in this world, through the enlargement of love in myself, and through the union of beings through love, produces at the same time other effects, one or many, unseen by me. As for instance, I put together 8 toy cubes to make a picture on one side of them, not seeing the other sides of the constructed cubes, but on the other sides are being formed pictures just as regular, though unseen by me. 10. I have thought much about God, about the essence of my life, and it seemed I only doubted one and the other and believed in my own conclusions. And then, one time, not long ago, I simply had the desire to lean upon my faith in God and in the indestructibility of my soul, and to my astonishment, I felt so firm and calm a confidence as I have never felt before. So that all my doubts and scrutinizings have evidently not only not weakened my faith, but have strengthened it to an enormous degree. 11. Reason is not given that we should recognize what we ought to love. This it won't disclose, but only for this, to show what we ought not to love. 12. As in each piece of handiwork, the principal art lies not in the regular making of certain things anew, but in the ever-bettering of the inevitable faults of a wrong and ruined work, so even in the business of life, the principal wisdom is not how to begin to act and how to lead life correctly, but how to better faults, how to liberate oneself from errors and seductions. 13. Happiness is the satisfaction of the requirements of a man's being living from birth to death in this world only. But the good is the satisfaction of the requirements of the eternal essence living in man. 14. The essence of the teachings of Christ consists in this, that man ought to know who he is, that he should understand, like a bird which does not use its wings and runs on the land, that he is not a mortal animal dependent on the conditions of the world, but like a bird which has understood that it has wings and has faith in them, he should understand that he himself was never born and never died, and always is, and passes through this world in one of the innumerable forms of life to fulfill the will of him who sent him into this life. 3. 1. I have been thinking especially clearly of that which I have already said many times, that all the evil in the world comes only from this, that people look upon themselves, upon their own personality as a worthy object of their conscious life, upon themselves or upon a group of personalities, it is all the same. As long as a man lives for himself unconsciously, he does no harm. If there is a struggle, then the struggle is an unconscious one, which is ended at once, when the struggle with surroundings is ended. Man adjusts himself to it, or he goes under, and this struggle is neither cruel, nor is it an evil one. The struggle begins to be cruel only when man directs his consciousness upon it, prepares it, strengthens and multiplies its energy tenfold and hundredfold. As Pascal says, there are three kinds of people. One kind know nothing and sit quietly, and just as quiet are those who know. But there are a middle kind who don't know but believe they do. From them comes all the evil in the world. They are the people in whom consciousness has awakened, but they don't know how to use it. 2. The whole thing lies in this, that you should always remember who you are. There is no situation so difficult from which the way out would not immediately offer itself if you only would remember that you are not a temporary material manifestation, but an eternal omnipresent being. I am the resurrection and the life. He that believeth in me shall never die, and though he were dead, yet shall he live. Believest thou this? I walked on the street. A wretched beggar approached me. I forgot who I was and passed by, and then suddenly I remembered, and just as naturally as the hungry begin to eat and the tired sit down, I turned back and handed him something. It is the same with the temptation to quarrel, to insult, to be vain. 3. One cannot voluntarily cease to remain awake, i.e., to fall asleep. Just as little can one voluntarily cease to live. Life is more important than the will, than desire. 4. Receive with thankfulness the enjoyments of the flesh, all that you meet on the way, if they are not sinful. In short, if they do not go against your consciousness, if they do not make it suffer. But use the efforts of your will, your liberty, only to serve God. 4. 1. Oh, not to forget death for a moment, into which at any moment you can fall. If we would only remember that we are not standing upon an even plane, if you think we are standing so, then you are only imagining that those who have gone away have fallen overboard, and you yourself are afraid that you will fall overboard. But that we are rolling on, without stopping, running into each other, getting ahead and being got ahead of, yonder behind the curtain, which hides from us those who are going away, and will hide us from those who remain. If we remember that always, then, how easy and joyous it is to live and roll together, yonder down the same incline, in the power of God, with whom we have been, and in whose power we are now, and will be afterwards, and forever. I have been feeling this very keenly. 2. There is no more convincing proof of the existence of God than the faculty of the soul by which we can transport ourselves into other beings. Out of this faculty flows both love and reason, but neither one nor the other is in us, but they are outside of us, and we only coincide with them. 3. The power to kill oneself is free play given to people. God did not want slaves in this life, but free workers. If you remain in this life, then it means that its conditions are advantageous to you. If advantageous, then work. If you go away from the conditions here, if you kill yourself, then the same thing will be put before you again there. So, there is nowhere to go. It would be good to write the history of what a man lives through in this life who committed suicide in a past life. How, coming up against the same requirements which were placed before him in the other life, he comes to the realization that he must fulfill them. And in this life, he is more intelligent than in the others, remembering the lesson given him. 4. How does it happen that a clever, educated man believes in the nonsensical? Man thinks that which his heart desires. Only if his heart desires the truth, and only if it does, will he think the truth. But if his heart desires earthly pleasures and peace, he will think of that which will bring him earthly pleasures and peace, or still something else. But as it is not an attribute of man to have earthly pleasures and peace, he will think falsely. And to be able to think falsely, he will hypnotize himself. 5. Life is the desire for the good. Everything that lives, lives only because it desires the good. That which does not desire the good does not live. Man, when awakened to a reasoning consciousness, is conscious of life in himself, i.e., of the desire for the good. But since this consciousness is engendered in the separate bodily being of man, since man learns that life is the desire for the good when he is already separated from others by his bodily being, therefore, in the first awakening of man to a reasoning consciousness, it seems to him that life, i.e., the desire for the good which he recognizes in himself, has for its object his separate bodily being. And man begins to live consciously for the good of his separate being, begins to use that reason of his which revealed to him the essence of all life, the desire for the good, in order to secure the good for his own separate being. But the longer a man lives, the more obvious it becomes to him that his purpose is unattainable, and therefore, while he has not yet made clear to himself his error, even before he recognizes by reason the impossibility of the good for a separate personality, man knows by experience and feeling the error of activity which is directed to the good of his own separate personality. And he naturally strives that his life, his desire for the good, be drawn away from his own personality and brought over to other things, to comrades, friends, family, society. This same reason which he desires to use for the attainment of the good for his own separate being shows man that this good is unattainable, that it becomes destroyed by the struggle between the separate beings for the desired good, destroyed by the unpreventable, innumerable disasters and sufferings which threaten man, and above all, by the unavoidable illnesses, sufferings, old age and death which occur in the individual life of man. No matter how man might expand his desire for the good to other beings, he cannot but see that all these separate beings are like him, subject to unavoidable sufferings and death, and therefore they, just as he, cannot have real life by themselves. And it is just this error of men who have awakened to the consciousness of life that the Christian teaching dissipates, in showing to man that as soon as a consciousness of life has awakened in him, i.e., the desire for the good, then his being, his self, is no longer his separate bodily being, but that same consciousness of life, the desire for the good, not for himself, which was born in his separate being. The consciousness, therefore, of the desire for the good is the desire for the good for everything existent. And the desire for the good for everything existent is God. The Christian teaching teaches just this, that his Son, who resembles God, and who was sent by the Father into the world, that the will of the Father be fulfilled in him, lives in man with an awakened consciousness, the conversation with Nicodemus. The Christian teaching reveals to man with an awakened consciousness that the meaning and the aim of his life does not consist, as it seemed to him before, in the acquiring of the greater good for his own separate personality, or for other such personalities like him, no matter how many they are, but only in the fulfillment in this world of the will of the Father who has sent man into the world. It reveals also to man the will of the Father in regard to the Son. The will of the Father in regard to the Son is that there should be manifested in this world that desire for the good which forms the essence of his life, so that man living in this world should wish the good to a greater and greater number of beings, and consequently he should serve them as he serves his own good. 6. 1. That the desire for the good is not God, but only one of his manifestations, one of the sides from which we see God. God in me is manifested by the desire for the good. 2. That this God which is enclosed in man begins to strive to free himself in broadening and enlarging the being in whom he dwells. Then, seeing the impassable limits of this being, he tries to free himself by going outside of this being and embracing other beings. 3. That a reasoning being cannot find room for himself in the life of an individual, and that as soon as he becomes reasoning, he tries to go out of it. 4. That the Christian teaching reveals to man that the essence of his life is not his separate being, but God, which is enclosed in his being. This God, therefore, becomes known to man through reason and love. 5. And above all, that the desire for the good for oneself, love for oneself, could exist in man only up to the time when reason had not yet awakened in him. But as soon as reason had wakened in him, then it became clear to man that the desire for the good for himself, a separate being, was futile, because the good is not realizable for a separate and mortal being. Just as soon as reason appeared, then there became possible only one kind of desire for the desire for the good for all, because with the desire for the good for all, there is no struggle but union, and no death but the transmission of life. God is not love, but in living, unreasoning beings. He is manifested through a love for oneself, and in living, reasoning beings, through love for everything that exists. 1. In order to believe in immortality, one has to live an immortal life here. I.e., to live not towards oneself, but towards God, not for oneself, but for God. Man, in this life, seems to be standing with one foot on a board and the other on the earth. And as soon as his reason has awakened, he sees that that board upon which he was just about to step lies over an abyss, and it not only bends and creaks, but is already falling, and man transfers his weight to that foot which stands on the earth. How not be afraid if one stands on that which bends and creaks and falls, and how be afraid, and of what to be afraid, if you stand on that upon which everything falls, and below which it is impossible to fall? The First Step, an insightful essay on morality and compassion by Leo Tolstoy. Fasting is an indispensable condition of a good life. But in fasting, as in self-control in general, the question arises, with what shall we begin? How to fast? How often to eat? What to avoid eating? And as we can do no work seriously without regarding the necessary order of sequence, so also we cannot fast without knowing where to begin, with what to commence self-control in food, fasting, and even an analysis of how to fast and where to begin. The notion seems ridiculous and wild to the majority of men. I remember how, with pride at his originality, an evangelical preacher who was attacking monastic asceticism once said to me, "Ours is not a Christianity of fasting and privations, but of beefsteaks." Christianity, or virtue in general, and beefsteaks. During a long period of darkness and lack of all guidance, pagan or Christian, so many wild, immoral ideas have made their way into our life, especially into that lower region of the first steps toward a good life, our relation to food, to which no one paid any attention, that it is difficult for us even to understand the audacity and senselessness of upholding, in our days, Christianity or virtue with beefsteaks. We are not horrified by this association, solely because a strange thing has befallen us. We look and see not, listen and hear not. There is no bad odor, no sound, no monstrosity, to which man cannot become so accustomed that he ceases to remark what would strike a man unaccustomed to it. Precisely so it is in the moral region, Christianity and morality with beefsteaks. A few days ago I visited the slaughterhouse in our town of Tula. It is built on the new and improved system practiced in large towns with a view to causing the animals as little suffering as possible. It was on a Friday, 2 days before Trinity Sunday. There were many cattle there, long before this, when reading that excellent book. The Ethics of Diet, I had wished to visit a slaughterhouse in order to see with my own eyes the reality of the question raised when vegetarianism is discussed. But at first I felt ashamed to do so, as one is always ashamed of going to look at suffering which one knows is about to take place, but which one cannot avert, and so I kept putting off my visit. But a little while ago I met on the road a butcher returning to Tula after a visit to his home. He is not yet an experienced butcher, and his duty is to stab with a knife. I asked him whether he did not feel sorry for the animals that he killed. He gave me the usual answer, "Why should I feel sorry? It is necessary." But when I told him that eating flesh is not necessary, but is only a luxury, he agreed. And then he admitted that he was sorry for the animals. "But what can I do? I must earn my bread," he said. "At first I was afraid to kill. My father, he never even killed a chicken in all his life." The majority of Russians cannot kill. They feel pity and express the feeling by the word fear. This man had also been afraid, but he was so no longer. He told me that most of the work was done on Fridays, when it continues until the evening. Not long ago, I also had a talk with a retired soldier, a butcher, and he too was surprised at my assertion that it was a pity to kill, and said the usual things about its being ordained. But afterwards, he agreed with me, especially when they are quiet, tame cattle. They come, poor things, trusting you. It is very pitiful. This is dreadful. Not the suffering and death of the animals, but that man suppresses in himself unnecessarily the highest spiritual capacity, that of sympathy and pity toward living creatures like himself, and by violating his own feelings becomes cruel. And how deeply seated in the human heart is the injunction not to take life. Once, when walking from Moscow, I was offered a lift by some carters who were going from Serpukhov to a neighboring forest to fetch wood. It was the Thursday before Easter. I was seated in the first cart with a strong, red, coarse carman, who evidently drank. On entering a village, we saw a well-fed, naked, pink pig being dragged out of the first yard to be slaughtered. It squealed in a dreadful voice, resembling the shriek of a man. Just as we were passing, they began to kill it. A man gashed its throat with a knife. The pig squealed still more loudly and piercingly, broke away from the men, and ran off covered with blood. Being nearsighted, I did not see all the details. I saw only the human-looking pink body of the pig and heard its desperate squeal, but the carter saw all the details and watched closely. They caught the pig, knocked it down, and finished cutting its throat. When its squeals ceased, the carter sighed heavily. "Do men really not have to answer for such things?" he said. "So strong is man's aversion to all killing. But by example, by encouraging greediness, by the assertion that God has allowed it, and above all by habit, people entirely lose this natural feeling." On Friday, I decided to go to Tula, and meeting a meek, kind acquaintance of mine, I invited him to accompany me. "Yes, I have heard that the arrangements are good, and have been wishing to go and see it, but if they are slaughtering, I will not go in." "Why not? That's just what I want to see. If we eat flesh, it must be killed." No, I cannot." It is worth remarking that this man is a sportsman and himself kills animals and birds. So we went to the slaughterhouse. Even at the entrance one noticed the heavy, disgusting, fetid smell, as of carpenter's glue or paint on glue. The nearer we approached, the stronger became the smell. The building is of red brick, very large, with vaults and high chimneys. We entered the gates. To the right was a spacious enclosed yard, 3/4 of an acre in extent. Twice a week cattle are driven in here for sale, and adjoining this enclosure was the porter's lodge. To the left were the chambers, as they are called, i.e. rooms with arched entrances, sloping asphalt floors, and contrivances for moving and hanging up the carcasses. On a bench against the wall of the porter's lodge were seated 6 butchers, in aprons covered with blood, their tucked-up sleeves disclosing their muscular arms also besmeared with blood. They had finished their work 1/2 an hour before, so that day we could only see the empty chambers. Though these chambers were open on both sides, there was an oppressive smell of warm blood. The floor was brown and shining, with congealed black blood in the cavities. One of the butchers described the process of slaughtering and showed us the place where it was done. I did not quite understand him, and formed a wrong but very horrible idea of the way the animals are slaughtered, and I fancied that, as is often the case, the reality would very likely produce upon me a weaker impression than the imagination. But in this, I was mistaken. The next time I visited the slaughterhouse, I went in good time. It was the Friday before Trinity, a warm day in June. The smell of glue and blood was even stronger and more penetrating than on my first visit. The work was at its height. The duty yard was full of cattle, and animals had been driven into all the enclosures beside the chambers. In the street, before the entrance, stood carts to which oxen, calves, and cows were tied. Other carts drawn by good horses and filled with live calves, whose heads hung down and swayed about, drew up and were unloaded, and similar carts containing the carcasses of oxen, with trembling legs sticking out, with heads and bright red lungs and brown livers, drove away from the slaughterhouse. The dealers themselves, in their long coats, with their whips and knouts in their hands, were walking about the yard, either marking with tar cattle belonging to the same owner, or bargaining, or else guiding oxen and bulls from the great yard into the enclosures which lead into the chambers. These men were evidently all preoccupied with money matters and calculations, and any thought as to whether it was right or wrong to kill these animals was as far from their minds as were questions about the chemical composition of the blood that covered the floor of the chambers. No butchers were to be seen in the yard. They were all in the chambers at work. That day, about 100 head of cattle were slaughtered. I was on the point of entering one of the chambers, but stopped short at the door. I stopped both because the chamber was crowded with carcasses which were being moved about, and also because blood was flowing on the floor and dripping from above. All the butchers present were besmeared with blood, and had I entered, I, too, should certainly have been covered with it. One suspended carcass was being taken down, another was being moved toward the door, a third, a slaughtered ox, was lying with its white legs raised, while a butcher with strong hand was ripping up its tight-stretched hide. Through the door opposite the one at which I was standing, a big, red, well-fed ox was led in. 2 men were dragging it, and hardly had it entered when I saw a butcher raise a knife above its neck and stab it. The ox, as if all 4 legs had suddenly given way, fell heavily upon its belly, immediately turned over on one side, and began to work its legs and all its hind quarters. Another butcher at once threw himself upon the ox from the side opposite to the twitching legs, caught its horns and twisted its head down to the ground, while another butcher cut its throat with a knife. From beneath the head there flowed a stream of blackish-red blood, which a besmeared boy caught in a tin basin. All the time this was going on, the ox kept incessantly twitching its head as if trying to get up, and waved its 4 legs in the air. The basin was quickly filling, but the ox still lived, and its stomach heaving heavily. Both hind and forelegs worked so violently that the butchers held aloof. When one basin was full, the boy carried it away on his head to the albumin factory, while another boy placed a fresh basin, which also soon began to fill up. But still the ox heaved its body and worked its hind legs. When the blood ceased to flow, the butcher raised the animal's head and began to skin it. The ox continued to writhe. The head, stripped of its skin, showed red with white veins, and kept the position given it by the butcher. On both sides hung the skin. Still the animal did not cease to writhe. Then another butcher caught hold of one of the legs, broke it, and cut it off. In the remaining legs and the stomach, the convulsions still continued. The other legs were cut off and thrown aside, together with those of other oxen belonging to the same owner. Then the carcass was dragged to the hoist and hung up, and the convulsions were over. Thus I looked on from the door at the 2nd, 3rd, 4th ox. It was the same with each, the same cutting off of the head with bitten tongue, and the same convulsed members. The only difference was that the butcher did not always strike at once so as to cause the animal's fall. Sometimes he missed his aim, whereupon the ox leaped up, bellowed, and covered with blood, tried to escape. But then his head was pulled under a bar, struck a second time, and he fell. I afterwards entered by the door at which the oxen were led in. Here I saw the same thing, only nearer, and therefore more plainly. But chiefly I saw here, what I had not seen before, how the oxen were forced to enter this door. Each time an ox was seized in the enclosure and pulled forward by a rope tied to its horns, the animal, smelling blood, refused to advance and sometimes bellowed and drew back. It would have been beyond the strength of two men to drag it in by force, so one of the butchers went round each time, grasped the animal's tail, and twisted it so violently that the gristle crackled, and the ox advanced. When they had finished with the cattle of one owner, they brought in those of another. The first animal of his next lot was not an ox, but a bull, a fine, well-bred creature, black, with white spots on its legs, young, muscular, full of energy. He was dragged forward, but he lowered his head and resisted sturdily. Then the butcher who followed behind seized the tail, like an engine driver grasping the handle of a whistle, twisted it. The gristle crackled, and the bull rushed forward, upsetting the men who held the rope. Then it stopped, looking sideways with its black eyes, the whites of which had filled with blood. But again the tail crackled, and the bull sprang forward and reached the required spot. The striker approached, took aim, and struck. But the blow missed the mark. The bull leaped up, shook his head, bellowed, and covered with blood, broke free and rushed back. The men at the doorway all sprang aside, but the experienced butchers, with the dash of men inured to danger, quickly caught the rope. Again, the tail operation was repeated, and again the bull was in the chamber, where he was dragged under the bar, from which he did not again escape. The striker quickly took aim at the spot where the hair divides like a star, and notwithstanding the blood, found it, struck, and the fine animal, full of life, collapsed, its head and legs writhing while it was bled and the head skinned. "There, the cursed devil hasn't even fallen the right way," grumbled the butcher as he cut the skin from the head. 5 minutes later, the head was stuck up, red instead of black, without skin. The eyes, that had shone with such splendid colour 5 minutes before, fixed and glassy. Afterwards I went into the compartment where small animals are slaughtered, a very large chamber with asphalt floor and tables with backs, on which sheep and calves are killed. Here the work was already finished. In the long room, impregnated with the smell of blood, were only 2 butchers. One was blowing into the leg of a dead lamb and patting the swollen stomach with his hand. The other, a young fellow in an apron besmeared with blood, was smoking a bent cigarette. There was no one else in the long, dark chamber, filled with a heavy smell. After me there entered a man, apparently an ex-soldier, bringing in a young yearling ram, black with a white mark on its neck, and its legs tied. This animal he placed upon one of the tables, as if upon a bed. The old soldier greeted the butchers, with whom he was evidently acquainted, and began to ask when their master allowed them leave. The fellow with the cigarette approached with a knife, sharpened it on the edge of the table, and answered that they were free on holidays. The live ram was lying as quietly as the dead inflated one, except that it was briskly wagging its short little tail, and its sides were heaving more quickly than usual. The soldier pressed down its uplifted head gently, without effort. The butcher, still continuing the conversation, grasped with his left hand the head of the ram and cut its throat. The ram quivered, and the little tail stiffened and ceased to wave. The fellow, while waiting for the blood to flow, began to relight his cigarette, which had gone out. The blood flowed, and the ram began to writhe. The conversation continued without the slightest interruption. It was horribly revolting. And how about those hens and chickens which daily, in thousands of kitchens, with heads cut off and streaming with blood, comically, dreadfully flop about, jerking their wings? And see, a kind, refined lady will devour the carcasses of these animals with full assurance that she is doing right, at the same time asserting 2 contradictory propositions. First, that she is, as her doctor assures her, so delicate that she cannot be sustained by vegetable food alone, and that for her feeble organism, flesh is indispensable. And secondly, that she is so sensitive that she is unable not only herself to inflict suffering on animals, but even to bear the sight of suffering, whereas the poor lady is weak precisely because she has been taught to live upon food unnatural to man, and she cannot avoid causing suffering to animals, for she eats them. I only wish to say that for a good life, a certain order of good actions is indispensable, that if a man's aspirations toward right living be serious, they will inevitably follow one definite sequence. And in this sequence, the first thing will be self-control in food, fasting. And in fasting, if he be really and seriously seeking to live a good life, the first thing from which he will abstain will always be the use of animal food. Because to say nothing of the excitation of the passions caused by such food, its use is simply immoral, as it involves the performance of an act which is contrary to the moral feeling, killing. We cannot pretend that we do not know this. We are not ostriches, and cannot believe that if we refuse to look at what we do not wish to see, it will not exist. This is especially the case when what we do not wish to see is what we wish to eat. If it were really indispensable, or if not indispensable, at least in some way useful. But it is quite unnecessary, and only serves to develop animal feelings, to excite desire, and to promote fornication and drunkenness. And this is continually being confirmed by the fact that young, kind, undepraved people, especially women and girls, without knowing how it logically follows, feel that virtue is incompatible with beefsteaks, and, as soon as they wish to be good, give up eating flesh. But why? If the wrongfulness of animal food was known to humanity so long ago, have people not yet come to acknowledge this law? Will be asked by those who are accustomed to be led by public opinion rather by reason. The answer to this question is that the moral progress of humanity, which is the foundation of every other kind of progress, is always slow, but that the sign of true, not casual progress is its uninterruptedness and its continual acceleration. And the progress of vegetarianism is of this kind. That progress is expressed in the actual life of mankind, which from many causes is involuntarily passing more and more from carnivorous habits to vegetable food, and is also deliberately following the same path in a movement which shows evident strength and which is growing larger and larger, namely vegetarianism. That movement has during the last 10 years advanced more and more rapidly. More and more books and periodicals on this subject appear every year. One meets more and more people who have given up meat, and abroad, especially Germany, England, and America, the number of vegetarian hotels and restaurants increases year by year. This movement should cause special joy to those whose life lies in the effort to bring about the kingdom of God on earth, not because vegetarianism is in itself an important step towards that kingdom. All true steps are both important and unimportant, but because it is a sign that the aspiration of mankind towards moral perfection is serious and sincere, for it has taken the one unalterable order of succession natural to it, beginning with the first step. One cannot fail to rejoice at this, as people could not fail to rejoice who, after striving to reach the upper story of a house by trying vainly and at random to climb the walls from different points, should at last assemble at the first step of the staircase and crowd towards it, convinced that there can be no way up except by mounting this first step of stairs.